So now we've looked at pretty much everything with regard to medicine in the medieval period in England. What we're going to finish off on this section with is probably the most significant part of medical history in all of Europe, possibly in all of the world, the Black Death. Okay, so we've got a little bit of a timeline and definition around what the Black Death was and how it came about and really where it originated. So in the 1300s, the Black Death sort of spread its way across Europe, and it was a series of plagues. It wasn't one specific plague, but it can probably be misconstrued as one specific plague because at the time, no one really knew what it was, and the two main diseases that created the Black Death really just, mixed together within Europe. So there was the Bubonic Plague, which is a plague that spreads through bites from fleas from rats. So the fleas would bite the rats, and the rats would come into come through into your house, into the streets, and everything like that. And that's what caused the Bubonic Plague. And then there's the Pneumonic Plague, which was an airborne plague spread through coughs and sneezes. Okay. Now, these are two very small and relatively easy to cure today. There are actually still people there are still cases in the world of Bubonic Plague. However, in most cases, they are cured. Back in the 1300s, however, there was a different story. There was a huge loss of life from these two diseases. Okay, specifically, if we look a little bit at Britain, in 1348 we start to see the first cases of it in Britain. Okay, so it arrives in Britain, and between 1348 and 1350 it kills at least 1/3 of the population. Now this is a debated number, so it's debated by historians. Exactly how many people died from this plague. However, there is pretty much unanimous agreement that it was around about 1/3 of the population. Okay, maybe some people put it as higher than that, some people put it as lower than that. Okay, and there were further outbreaks that came about through the Middle Ages, but nowhere near in terms of the same intensity as this period here. These couple of years in which the Black Death killed around 1/3 of the population. Not the population of Britain, we're looking at Britain here specifically, but the population of all of Europe, about 1/3 of them died. Okay, so further outbreaks, but not as significant. Okay, still significant, however, not as significant and as well known as what we see as the Black Death today. Okay, so if we go up here, there were a few beliefs about the Black Death, and one specifically is, you can't really blame people for this, is that they believed it was punishment from God. Okay, he believed that it was God that caused the plague, and he was given this disease for the sins of man. So people believed from this that the way to cure the Black Death, Black Death, was, I can't spell tonight, was simply through, again, prayer. Okay, so they believed that praying, they believed that fasting would help cure the Black Death. Now, specifically the latter is probably the least. It's probably the worst thing that you could do during the Black Death, is to just not get enough nutrients inside your body. However, they believed that's what would happen. Others thought it was an imbalance of humour, so it led to a lot of bloodletting and purging. Others suggested it was spread by miasma, so we have lots of cleaning of air, and then others used quote-unquote magic potions to try and cure it. So what we can see here when we look at the Black Death is that we see that really the culmination of all of these supernatural and more natural practices and beliefs that were circulating around in medieval England all came together and were used extensively to try and cure people of the Black Death. Bear in mind, again, 1/3 of the population died from this disease, okay? Which means that people were desperate and tried anything. People used prayer, people used bloodletting, people used incense to clean the air. All of these things, all to no avail, okay? Other more local governments or local organisations tried other methods that were really relatively unheard of as a general practice to try and get rid of this epidemic. So in Winchester, people believed that you could catch plague from being close to victims, okay? Victims of the plague or the dead bodies, okay? So this was, as we can imagine, it was pretty much correct, okay? Being around people who were infected with the disease would make you more likely to get the disease yourself, okay? However, people in Winchester, they believed it. However, they, instead of trying to find a ways of getting away from the victims of the disease, because the people in Winchester are already caught this disease at this point, people decided that when it became too full, they would build cemeteries outside of the town, okay? However, the people working at these cemeteries, so people working here outside of the towns, would simply become prone to the disease and then go back into the town and be prone to spreading the disease further, okay? So when we say it's correct, the idea is correct, however, that in principle, however, in practice, they didn't go about the right way. Gloucester went about it a different way. They tried to shut everybody out. So they tried an almost isolationist policy to try and make sure that nobody would come in and out. So no one coming into the city, or the town, should we say town. They thought that would be a way of doing it. And this really does piggyback off the idea that it being close to the victims of the disease would cause it to spread. So this was probably a better idea than simply, instead of burying people inside the town, burying them outside the town. This is probably a better idea. However, by November 1348, the disease reaches London, okay? And this is where it expands to an exponential rate, okay? So it goes up. Bear in mind that London is a very close, densely packed city at this point. It's one of the largest in England. So there's a huge amount of victims that can spread the disease further and further, and this leads in January 1349 for Edward III to close Parliament, to try and just calling Parliament off. Okay, so we see how desperate people became when it comes to the Black Death and the methods and treatments that they tried to use, okay, to try and get rid of it. However, what is really important about the Black Death is the amount of influence it had on society in the world, okay, in Europe, but we're going to look specifically at England. So once there was less people, when a third of the population died, this led to there being fewer workers. That's just obvious, okay? And the fewer workers were able to demand higher wages, okay, because it would cause the people who wanted this work being done had no other choice. They couldn't go to other people because there were no other people. Everyone else had died. So these higher wages led to higher living standards. Higher living standards following the Black Death, okay? And again, this also ties in to the idea of land costing less because there was less people to buy the land. Therefore, the supply of land relative to the amount of people who were buying it went up. Okay, so the cost of it would decrease because people would want to get rid of the land because there's no other people to sell this land to. Okay, so what about the actual pieces of legislation that came about from this? Well, we have one very specific piece of legislation here in 1349, okay? So this is just before the end of the Black Death, just the year before, okay? But it's a point where it had reached its peak and gone back down. The Ordinances of Labourers, and what this effectively did was try to stop peasants from moving around the country. So stop peasants from moving around the country. And the reason why peasants could move around the country was because there was so little workers now, because the third of the population had died. I want to make that clear. One third of the population died in this horrendous event. So a third of the population means that the peasants are they're more free to do other things, and this leads to this trying to stop peasants from moving from different countries. And if you're someone who studies Russian history, you might be familiar with this sort of idea being a sort of a step towards, we'll say a step towards what was known as serfdom. Serfdom. And serfdom is the idea that a peasant is tied to the land they work. So is tied to the land they work. Okay, it's a form of slavery almost, and this wasn't introduced in Russia until the 1640s. Okay, so you can see really that the idea of peasants moving isn't a good idea. Obviously, in the UK and in England, this didn't actually come to fruition. But the sort of the groundworks behind it, trying to stop peasants from moving around the country to try and keep them towards their land, was sort of an almost pseudo serfdom, where it was sort of like the stages towards serfdom. However, we find in 1381 we have what was known as the Peasants Revolt. And we also get, not in the same year, but a few hundred years later, maybe the late 1400s, we get the end of the feudal system, okay, the feudal system of the medieval time. And people believe that the Peasants Revolt and the feudal system the downfall of the feudal system, shall we say, came about all because of the Black Death. All because of the intense social changes that came from this incredibly violent and incredibly destructive disease. Okay, so that really covers it for the medieval period in England. Okay, we have talked about the supernatural views of medicine. We talked about the more natural ones. We've talked about the influence of medicine from the ancient world, coming from Hippocrates and Galen. We then talked a lot about the influence that Islamic medicine had, and not only England but also on all of Europe, and the breakthroughs that were made there. We then talked about the kind of treatments people would get for the diseases that occurred in that time, and then talked about the sort of hygiene and the way in which hygiene was organised in the rural and urban environment in England. And then we ended it off by talking about the most significant period of arguably the most significant period of English medical history, but definitely the most significant period of medieval medical history, or possibly even medieval history entirely, the Black Death, and how that affected the social changes and caused and brought about radical social reforms years later.